and welcome to part 4 of the lecture series, An Introduction to Philosophy. This one is called P2 Elaborated Epistemology. And once again, at the point, the risk of repetition, P2 is my own kind of idiosyncratic way of referring to what we take to be philosophy now as just one more academic discipline among the many, many academic disciplines in higher education. The discipline which deals with problems in one or more of 3 areas, metaphysics, ethics, and or epistemology. And here we are at epistemology. The theory of knowledge. Well, people say all the time, I know this or I know that. What do they mean? What is it to say that I know? There are more or less loose ways to do this and more or less strict ways to do this. Here's a rather loose way. Bill Maher has a segment regularly. I don't know it for a fact, but I just know that it's true. And there are many people who share Bill Maher's point of view on this. Suppose somebody says, I knew I was going to die. Well, actually, people do say this. Here's one. Sergeant Dakota Maher, U.S. Marine Corps. Here he is being awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor by the Commander-in-Chief for actions in Afghanistan in 2009. And as he recounts his experience under fire in Afghanistan, and it was a hairy experience, he says, I knew I was going to die. Well, obviously he didn't. He believed he was going to die. I have no doubt from his account that he actually believed that. But the thing is, I can believe something which is false. Obviously, it's false that he died, thank goodness. But I knew that I was going to die. I cannot know something which is false. So this sentence, when it's uttered by somebody who survived the incident they're describing, is at the very least paradoxical. Now, that's a loose view. The standard view of what it means to say I know or to know is strict. I know is stronger than I believe. I know is stronger than I expect. David Hume makes much of this. We'll come back to him presently. I know need not be as strong as saying I'm 100% certain about it, although philosophers disagree here. There are some, René Descartes notably, who says that, but it will still be pretty strong. Here's what's known as the standard view of knowledge. It's called JTB for short. Plato states the view in his dialogue Theaetetus. And basically what JTB says is that knowledge is true opinion accompanied by reason. That is to say, though, there are those 3 conditions, J, T, and B. Truth, T, opinion, belief, accompanied by reason, justification, J, JTB. So if I say, I know X, whatever that X happens to be, I have to meet the following 3 conditions. I must believe X to be the case. It must be true that X is the case. And I must have justification or reasons for believing that X is the case. All 3 together. For any claim to knowledge, then you can put together a checklist, J, T, and B. Can you check off all 3? If you can check off all 3 according to this view, then you are justified in saying, I know X, whatever X may be. And if you cannot check off all 3, then you are not so justified. Now, what's the relationship between knowledge and belief? Is knowledge mere belief, merely belief? Well, in the Republic, Plato sets forward conditions which have had long-standing weight. Plato contrasted opinion or belief, whether belief or conjecture, with knowledge. Although in Theaetetus, which I just quoted a little while ago, he characterizes knowledge as a special case of belief/opinion plus something else. But mere belief or opinion just by itself is of a lower order than is knowledge. Now, we don't need to quibble about definitions here, nor about psychological distinctions concerning how seriously or fervently a thing is believed, or theological quibbles about what's the relation between belief and faith, or the same thing, any of that kind of stuff. There are those issues. For present purposes, though, we need to focus on content. Somebody said to Mark Twain, do you believe in infant baptism? And he said, do I believe it? Hell, I've seen it. Bernard Shaw, what a man believes may be ascertained not from his creed, but from the assumptions upon which he habitually acts. That is, people will tell you they believe something, but watch their actions and you'll see what they really believe. Nor will we pause long enough to chase what's an interesting rabbit, the ethics of belief. W.K. Clifford, interesting guy, 19th century philosopher, died rather young. It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. If you say, I don't have time to investigate what I'm saying, well, then you don't have time to believe, says Clifford. Earn this. That's his message. But we won't chase the rabbit, alas. For present purposes, it's enough to consider belief as an acceptance of or assent to the truth of a proposition for which there might be evidence. So it's not blind faith absent any evidence. If you say, I believe this, but I have no evidence for it, it's not in the right ballpark. The main point is not that belief is subjective, but what is the content to which acceptance or assent may be given. Now, by itself, simply having some belief or another is not enough to claim knowledge. So he said, she said. She said, I believe the number of atoms in the universe is even. And he says, how can you say that? I believe the number is odd. Okay, so each of them has a belief. The beliefs are conflicting, they're contrary. They cannot both be true. One would have to be true. I mean, it stands to reason, even if we have no way of ascertaining the number of atoms, we don't have the number of atoms in the universe, it's either going to be even or it's going to be odd, because every number is either even or odd. As long as it's a finite number, and it should be a finite number, that would be the case. So we have here two beliefs, but we don't really have justification, and we have no idea of knowing whether either one of them is true, although one of them would have to be true. Just don't know which one. Is knowledge then a species of belief? Well, it's not just any belief, but according to justified true belief, yes, it is a species of belief. It's belief plus something else. Thus, in this view, knowledge is more than simply belief. It is belief, but it has to have some conditions added, that is, the T and the J, the truth and the justification. This Euler diagram kind of puts that in perspective. We can have all kinds of beliefs, not all of which are simultaneously justified and true. Knowledge, if it is indeed justified true belief, is a kind of belief, but a kind of belief with some further restrictions. So, one of the differences between knowledge and belief is this. I can believe just anything. I cannot know just anything, however. I can believe something which is false. So I can say I believe unicorns exist, and I may be sincere in that belief, even though unicorns, as far as we can tell, do not exist. But I cannot know something which is false. If it's false that unicorns exist, I can't say I know that unicorns exist. Knowledge is subject to a truth condition to which simple belief is not subject. So if I say I know something, I'm implicitly claiming that I believe it to be true. Hillary Clinton belongs to a witch coven? I never knew that. Well, here's the justification. Photos don't lie. There she is with the cauldron. But I simply cannot say 1 + 1 = 3. I never knew that, because 1 + 1 is 3. It's not true. Yesterday I knew that unicorns were purple. Today I know that unicorns do not exist. Okay, this is not even wrong. There are worse things than uttering a false statement, than having a mistaken belief. Suppose I say to you, why is a mouse when it spins? Why is a mouse when it spins? That's not you, that's me. I'm not making sense. I'm using words that are in the dictionary, but I'm not forming a proper sentence. It just sounds like I'm speaking English. I'm just talking gibberish. I'm going bar, 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 bar. It sounds like English. It sounds like speech. It sounds like a sentence. It's really none of those things. So 1 + 1 = 3 is false. It is false that unicorns exist. I can't really know what I know to be false. I can believe what I know to be false, or so someone can believe what I know to be false, but then someone is simply mistaken by doing that. Whenever I say I know X, whatever X is, implicitly I'm also saying then that X is true. And this is a very strong claim. Belief is a much weaker one. Now let's look at it from an objective point of view. X is knowledge rather than I know X subjectively. How about whenever I say I have information that X? So that may seem to be a very strong claim. If I have information, I seem also to be asserting that the information, like the knowledge, is true. Consistent with the JTB view, I might be mistaken about information, in a way that I might not about knowledge, and it looks like I could be. It makes sense to talk about disinformation as opposed to misinformation. Disinformation is a deliberate lie to mislead. I'm telling you something false and I know it's false. Misinformation, I'm telling you something which is false, but I don't know that it's false. So I'm sincerely conveying it to you, even though it happens, in fact, to be mistaken. But can we speak of misknowledge or disknowledge? No, it doesn't make sense to say that someone misknows X or even disknows X. Okay, so that's JTB. Now, ho-hum, so what? What is JTB good for? Well, its initial use in the days of Plato was to get beyond he said, she said, to get beyond bald assertion. So Plato says to Aristotle, be, and Aristotle asks him, why? Give me a reason. Be by itself is just an assertion, but Plato could put his assertion be into a syllogism, which is the basic form of the deductive argument. If you take our other course, deductive logic, that's a really, really key bit there. We won't go into the details here. But let's say, here's a typical argument. I argue, my first premise is if A, then B, and I assert that A is the case. Well, if it's true that if A, then B, and if it's true that A is the case, then it must also be true necessarily that B is the case. Okay, but I have established B not just by a bald assertion by itself, but I've done so by providing some justification in the form of a reasoned argument. Of course, when Plato and Aristotle got tired of it, they would resort to stealing their discourse by other means, but they set the standard, at least, which we've tried to follow ever since. JTB forces me not to believe everything I think. Reality check. JTB lets me counteract merely assertive loudmouths. The ocean will take care of the Gulf oil spill on its own if it was left alone and left out there. Laissez-faire. Starve the beast, shrink the government in a bathtub, don't do anything. Well, why? JTB also gives us a tool when all those motivational speakers start tossing around quotes. Anybody that says, I love quotes? Yeah. Well, anybody can say anything and be quoted. So what? Is what they're saying true, cogent, any of these things? Another question. Other questions. JTB strictness is an antidote to truthiness. Do you solemnly swear to be truth-oriented in court? And there are worse things than truthiness. Roger Ailes, Fox News, the truth, quote unquote, is whatever people will believe. Or Ron Hubbard, Scientology, truth is whatever is true for you. Yeah, Ron, but what if that's not true for me? Alternative facts, which you use in real facts, prove you wrong. Or here's probably the most extreme. Rudy Giuliani, truth isn't truth. Our politicians leave a lot to be desired today. General Patrick Moynihan, former U.S. Senator, hit the nail on the head, I think, when he said, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. JTB also has a big downside. As Mark Twain tells us, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Now, of course, given JTB, we cannot literally know something if that something just ain't so. We cannot know what is false. So this is a bit of hyperbole. But suppose Bernie Russell is right when he says that science is what we know, philosophy is what we don't know. Science is what we know. Now, suppose science changes. For instance, what if we thought we knew something to be true at time T1 earlier that turns out to be false at some time T2 later? Oh, here's an example. And this is a big problem for the JTB thesis when this happens, when knowledge changes. Okay. It was once scientific knowledge that orcas do not attack sharks. I think I mentioned this in the previous lecture. But in October 1997, a 20-foot orca was observed to attack and kill a 10-foot great white shark. And therever after, I think I mentioned this also, everybody starts seeing orcas killing sharks. Kind of like Roger Bannister breaks the 4-mile barrier, then lots of other people do it shortly thereafter. And of course, we've learned some interesting things about orcas. Orcas have cultures. An orca will teach, in the North Atlantic, will teach its offspring to kill great white sharks by different techniques than orcas in the South Pacific. Interesting stuff. But on the JTB view, at least, if it was known that orcas do not attack sharks, this could only have been because this belief was true and this belief was justified. But if the belief that orcas do not attack sharks is not now true, then it was never true. And even if it may have been justified, at least in the negative sense that nobody had ever reported the contrary evidence, this is still a problem for the JTB thesis. It never really met the full requirements of JTB in the first place. We only thought that it did. It was merely believed falsely to be true. So we get B and perhaps J, but we don't get T. And remember, we need all three if the JTB view is going to work. We need to check off all three on the list. This is a huge paradox. It is a huge paradox in that one and the same general proposition, orcas don't attack sharks, was a true and part of science in 1996, but false and non-science in 1998. One and the same proposition cannot be both true and false. This is one of the basic laws of thought without which we cannot rationally proceed. It's called the law of non-contradiction. Anything, whatever it may be, cannot be both A and not A simultaneously. Now, if science tells us that the orca proposition is false, then as a general proposition, it cannot have been true in the past, but it remained a part of science. Thus, science at any point may contain both true and false propositions. So when we say a proposition is part of science, we cannot necessarily say that it's known, at least not if the JTB view of knowledge is adopted. Maybe we need another view of knowledge. And this is a big problem because, first of all, science is the most successful example of human knowledge in history. And secondly, science constantly changes. So are we to conclude, therefore, that science is not a body of knowledge, much less our most successful one? Are we to say, for example, science, just one more cognitive alternative. There's science, there's witchcraft, you can believe in chakras, you can believe in magic. Take your choice, it's really all one. This might be true for you, but it's not true for me. Batman slaps Robin. Relativism. Well, one alternative to deal with this is to grasp the bull by the horns and acknowledge that science does have a history in which many scientific ideas have been shown, in fact, to be false. My friend Larry Loudon provocatively says the following: most science is false. Most science is false. Now, is Larry one of those guys, and there are such people, we saw a big brouhaha in the so-called science wars in the 1990s. Is Larry one of these people that says, well, you know, scientists are just another priesthood. They have their dogmas, but their dogmas are no better or worse than the dogmas of any other group, religious groups, you know, political groups, whatever you want. So just pick and choose, you know, as the fancy suits you. No. Larry is not one of those guys. He was very clearly on the other side of that debate about science. Is he spouting relativism? Far from it. But Larry's an historian of science, and he sees how many ideas have been tested and found wanting over what is a very long history of science. So as time elapses, lots of ideas that used to be considered possibly true will find themselves tossed out onto the scrap heap. That's exactly what has happened over the long history of science. So that's why most ideas that have had play within the history of science, we now regard as false. From the mid-20th century, the realization that science changes, grows, and progresses has been taken to have quite profound implications for the philosophy of science. And so we get from that period, and Larry is part of that, his book over on the right, one of the major contributions to that debate, what we now call history and philosophy of science. That is, previously, philosophers of science have said, okay, scientists, this is scientific methodology. If you follow this, you're doing science. And gradually we came to realize that, well, you know, what these prescriptive programs have preached generally aren't very descriptive of what scientists actually do. So in order to be able to come up with, if we can, some general notions of what science does methodologically, we need first and foremost to look into the history of the various sciences and see what the scientists in fact actually do before we go on to prescribe what they should be doing. That's the point of history and philosophy, HPS as it's sometimes called. And folks like Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn, Emily Lakatos, lots of people, Larry Loudon of course also, are major figures in that movement. Do we even need JTB? Karl Popper, I just mentioned, has a way around the paradox. He says that contrary to the JTB thesis, knowledge is not a species of belief in the first place. He calls his view objective knowledge. It's a weakness of JTB that begins by thinking of knowledge as subjective, as a species of belief believed in by some believer. On Popper's view, the basic question is rather, Not the subjective question, what can I believe justifiably, but what do we collectively know? Human knowledge is a body of propositions which is the collective property of the human species, but which can never be owned in toto by any one individual. Now, if anyone's read any sociology, this may sound kind of a familiar idea. It seems to me not unlike the general kind of idea put forth by Emil Durkheim, one of the founding fathers of sociology. Knowledge for Durkheim resides first and foremost in what he calls conscience collective, a collective consciousness in which individual knowers will participate, but knowledge itself isn't reducible either to the psychology, the belief, or the consciousness of the individual knower. And Popper is adamantly opposed. Popper has a lot of adamant oppositions. He's adamantly opposed to Plato, to Marx, to Hegel, to the notion of social engineering, and to the notion of sociology. But it seems to me that what Popper is saying here by way of objective knowledge is not at all unlike what Durkheim and others like him have said about things like conscience collective. Interesting implications of this view are, first of all, that no single individual can possibly know all knowledge, and secondly, this fact is not at all troublesome. Popper talks about three worlds. There's the physical world, there's world one, he calls it, there's the world of objective knowledge, world three, and then there's world two, subjective reality, which is kind of a bridge, if you will, between worlds one and two. Each individual knower can partake of some bit of objective knowledge, but that bit is not exclusively belief, and it's not even belief first and foremost. Okay. One of the things people note about God, if there's a God, is that he is or must be omniscient. He knows everything. That's why God never listens. Traditionally thought to be a property of God, but God aside, how do we characterize all the knowledge that there is? Where does omniscience, all knowledge, reside? Well, we've given up on the idea of the Renaissance man, talked about that in the first lecture, that is one single person who has it all in his head, whether this be Aristotle or Benjamin Jowett or even Thurston Veblen. Surely no one of us can claim possession of all knowledge, so where is it? Well, Popper had a number of friends who had interesting ideas also. Donald Campbell, research psychologist, Campbell talks about what he calls the fish scale model of omniscience. And you think about a fish, every individual scale overlaps several other scales, but not all the other scales. There's some overlap, there's some imbrication, if you will. It's like roof tiles, imbricated one on another, but not all of them on all of them. In the same way, what I know may overlap with the knowledge of some other people, but not with all people. There's going to be specialization. Some people are going to have knowledge that I share. Other people, probably most people, are going to have knowledge that I don't share, and they may not share my knowledge either. Knowledge is the entire collection of scales on the fish. Each individual knower is but one scale in the collection. So no single individual on this fish scale model knows it all. Knowledge is the imbricated property primarily of the whole human collectivity, omnisciently, world three. That's where omniscience resides. And not of any individual scale, any individual knower, world two. Not even Einstein knew it all, although he was a big scale on the fish. We could grant that. Furthermore, collective human knowledge does change. Objective knowledge has a history, back to HPS, History and Philosophy of Science. Over time, we'll learn, probably, because this is what we have learned in the past, that some of what we took for knowledge in the past is in fact false and must be dropped. So therefore, some of what we take to be knowledge now, we will find in future needs to be dropped likewise. Our knowledge, says Popper, can only be finite, while our ignorance must necessarily be infinite. However, the body of our knowledge, though finite, can change and can grow progressively. JTB, on the other hand, would seem to require that knowledge be perfect now and for all time. History and change are not factored in. This is particularly true of Plato and his view of knowledge. Some major criticism of that view. Popper, on the other hand, is impressed by the fact that knowledge is changing. It's never perfect. Indeed, it grows. It grows through refinement, mainly through a process of the loss of information. Hold that thought. That's an interesting idea of Popper's. We'll come back to that in the last of 3 problem lectures on what is the goal of our knowledge a little bit down the road. The more things we can show to be false, the more things we know. So there's an inverse relationship between the information we have and the knowledge we have. And most people think there's a direct relationship. So Popper has that. It's a really interesting idea here. On Popper's view, what do we know? Well, we never know precisely what things are true. When we know a proposition is false, we do know it is false. When we assert a proposition to be true, what we know is merely that it is not yet false, but might be. So, people used to say, oh, such and such a thing is scientifically proven. We don't tend to say that anymore. If we say such and such a thing is part of science, what we mean is it's provisionally true until or unless we show that it's not. That's what truth means. Truth doesn't mean absolute certainty, capital T. It means the best we can do for the moment, pending, subject to changes that might, unpredictable changes that might occur at some point. Hence, truth then can only mean what is provisionally true. Popper has a word for this. He calls it verisimilitude. We never entirely get to the truth, capital T, but we can approximate it. We can get closer to it. And we do so through the process called falsifiability, which I won't define here, but I will defer to, again, that later discussion that I mentioned. Objective knowledge through falsifiability, weird and distinctive idea. We're going to take it up later. Popper's view does at least seem to have the virtue of avoiding the glaring paradox, which is central to the JTB view. Okay, so JTB has a major criticism, but it also has some strengths. Again, this is to review. It counteracts merely assertive loudmouths. It releases me from having to believe everything I think. It allows us to get beyond he said, she said. It's an antidote to truthiness and to squishy epistemic relativism. Enter Popper. He is like Bill Gates, always bringing a patch to fix what he didn't do properly. Well, it was not Popper's fault here, maybe Bill Gates's, but he's got a patch to fix a strong view of knowledge. The price tag, though, is we need to think of knowledge other than as a set of conditions imposed on belief. We need to think of knowledge as something other than just primarily belief. It is rather the objective property of us all collectively. Now, JTB is not the only possible sense in which we can use the verb to know. It's one of a family of fairly strict ways to conceptualize what it means to know. Popper's is also a strict way in its own different fashion. And there are also less strict ways. Ordinary language presents us with an option of strict and less strict ways. So we have, for example, René Descartes. He says, we're not going to dignify a proposition with the label knowledge unless it consists of clear and distinct ideas. And anything less than clear and distinct is just non-knowledge, is a very high bar. On the other hand, other people have a lower bar, talk about knowledge in fuzzier terms. And let's think about some of these terms. Strict episteme versus fuzzy gnosis, fuzzy probability. Now, English does not have different words for knowledge. Some languages do. We talked about that. Well, actually, we haven't talked about this yet. This is the first time. These words can be different things. I can know in the sense that I have discursive knowledge, and I could explain a thing clearly, or I could pass an exam in a class on the subject. But I can know in the sense that I'm acquainted with. I have a little know-how, perhaps. Ne connaissez-vous pas Marie? Don't you know Marie? Yeah, I know her. Jenny in the Hood, sure. Could I write her biography? No. But I have some nodding acquaintance. Well, that's kind of knowledge. I know how to play the guitar, but I can't read music. Well, do I have some knowledge? Yes, because somebody who doesn't have even that knowledge can pick up a guitar and just make cacophony. My musical knowledge, though, can be in my fingertips rather than in my head between these two flaps of skin. The Greeks drew a distinction between these two different kinds of knowledge. They had words for them. Indeed, some other languages too, German and French too, whereas English doesn't. The Greeks distinguish between episteme and gnosis. Episteme, for example, science, clear and distinct ideas. There's Descartes' goal. You can be versed in something, maybe even know it for certain. It's test-taking kind of knowledge. It can be both first order and second order. We'll come to that later. Whereas gnosis is looser and fuzzier. Personal acquaintance, ne connaissez-vous pas Marie? Sure, Jenny from the Hood, I know her. Musicianship, awareness or understanding. It may be first order only. I may know something about something, but not have the second order ability to explain that. So on a continuum from stricter to looser, we can rank JTB toward the stricter end, gnosis toward the looser end. Knowledge, is it sharp or fuzzy? Well, some philosophers set a very high bar. I mentioned Descartes. Plato does the same thing in his famous divided line in the Republic. There's doxa, which is fuzzy and unreliable. There's episteme, which is reliable. And Descartes, of course, as I mentioned before. But often people use the verb to know in ways that are weaker than this. Gnosis, fuzzy knowledge, is a case in point. Michael Polanyi, who was actually a working scientist, but he wrote on philosophical topics, personal knowledge and the tacit dimension, two of his major works. We know more than we can tell. That is, we know things which we genuinely know, says Polanyi at least, even if we cannot articulate what we think we know fully, even if we can't articulate enough to pass an exam, for example. So gnosis is one kind of fuzzy knowledge. Probability is another. For example, if we can't be certain of X, but X just has such a high probability that the prospect of it being false is just vanishingly small, then I may say, well, I know X. For example, the probability of snow in Los Angeles in June is so low, I might say, I know it'll never snow in LA in June. Doesn't do this in LA. Well, at least not in June. Although every once in a while, even LA gets snow. The year my wife was born, for example. I know it will not snow in June in LA, so it would differ from other claims of snow. For example, I know that I'm depressed right now. Okay, well, if anybody has insight into my being depressed, I guess I would be the one. Behaviorists would say we would have to assess signs by looking at external behavior. I'm not sure how you could do that thoroughly, how I could behave in such a way that I do when and only when I'm depressed, but not in other ways. But I can pretty much have insight into whether I'm depressed or not, or at least maybe not during the time, but after the fact, I can look back and say, yeah, I was really depressed. Maybe I was denying it at the time, but I have perhaps some privileged insight into that. I know that 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, that's a pretty solid claim to know. You cannot not know that. We'll come to that a little later. Our second problem is the analytic and synthetic distinction in which this goes. Assuming that the only way to know if I'm depressed though is for me to communicate my inner state, it would seem I would seem to know this more clearly than whether I know it's going to snow in LA in June. And of course, 1 + 1 = 2 is even stronger. I know that it will never snow in June in LA in June, sorry. However high the probability is still not going to meet the strict standards of JTB, and we'll see why when we look at a little while Hume's problem of induction. On the other hand, the high probability, might be quite sufficient for making practical decisions. Okay, if I'm in charge of flights out of LAX in June and I don't de-ice the wings, and maybe it happens to snow, am I negligent? It doesn't seem reasonable. The best of my knowledge, best knowledge anybody could have had in those circumstances, de-icing is not called for, and there are flukes of nature. It happens sometimes. Improbabilities occur. Wouldn't always insisting on the strict rule of JTB, though, force us to make the good the enemy of the perfect. And this is not to say that there might not be some ambulance-chasing lawyer who might come after me if I failed to de-ice the wings on planes at LAX in June. They will say I was negligent, I should have known better. But in court, my decision might very well pass the test of what a reasonable person would believe under the circumstances, and that, for some purposes, legal purposes, is sufficient. Okay, JTB is strong. We already established that. But what if its strengths become impractical? What are some costs and benefits of looser views than JTB? There is generally what's called knowledge use. Philosophers are not the only ones who use the term knowledge, but there are people who talk about the production of knowledge, a la Fritz Machlep, or the application of knowledge, a la Marx and Holzner. Knowledge, says Berger and Luckmann, in their social construction of reality, is whatever passes for knowledge in society. And this book in particular, the Berger and Luckmann book, tends to excite and infuriate a lot of philosophers working in the area of epistemology, because they see it as endorsing a kind of squishy epistemic relativism. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the case with Berger and Luckmann, but it certainly is a widespread perception that they do this. But at the same time, there's something like Derek Price's scientometrics. Now, he was the founder of that field. There's now a whole journal devoted to that, and others as well. Let's look at science and see how it grows and how it changes, independently of our assessing the epistemic content of science, we can think of it as knowledge and ask about how knowledge works in practical ways. And epistemology is one way of looking at knowledge and an important way of looking at knowledge, but we need to be aware that there are other disciplines, there are other points of view, and I think philosophers of knowledge would do well to take that better into account perhaps than some of them have. People use knowledge and indeed need to use it. Isn't it better to act knowingly than to act unknowingly? But it may not always be possible to use knowledge under strict conditions of the JTB sort that philosophers favor, and with good reason they favor. Let's look, for example, at law. Take the fanciful example I just gave about de-icing the airplane wings. Okay, the reasonable man test could apply in court. If a reasonable man would not believe that it was likely, probable that the wings would ice up in June, then how can you hold somebody negligent for not taking the precaution of de-icing, the probable precaution of de-icing wings at that airport at that time of the year? And generally the law uses less strict standards than JTB, the reasonable man test, for example, or in civil cases, the preponderance of evidence, or even in criminal cases, a slightly stricter view beyond a reasonable doubt, but not necessarily strictly strong. If we say, for example, so-and-so is guilty in court or so-and-so is not guilty, this doesn't need to rest on total information or complete certainty, because usually we can't get either of those things. Law often deals in situations in which a great deal of uncertainty obtains, but the law needs to arrive at decisions. Legal decisions need to be able to answer to a standard of reasonableness of some sort. At the same time, there may be less than full information. Okay. Talked about omniscience a minute ago. God is omniscient. God knows everything. So why don't we bring God into court and put him on the witness stand and ask him to tell us what's true? Well, if we had the God's eye point of view, this would certainly eliminate uncertainty. Now, you may think this is just a joke, completely fanciful. Actually, it's not, because there was a time before we hit on the notion of trial by jury in which we did exactly that, in which we deposed God. Trial by ordeal, for example, or witches. You throw a witch in the water. If she's a witch, she'll float. If she drowns, she wasn't a witch, so she was innocent. If she floats, she's guilty and must be tried and punished. Trial by ordeal, you had a couple of guys basically with swords hack it out, and God would make the right person prevail in that combat. This was law by miracle. Now, if God's really behind the scenes, then yes, his verdict would be infallible. But we evolved away from that. Trial by ordeal gave way to a more rational process of trial by jury and evidence. Even so, evidence is rarely 100%. The vote of a jury is taken as a proxy measure for actual guilt or innocence, and we know that juries can be wrong. Jury verdicts, unlike God, are always potentially fallible, often are. If you're familiar with the Innocence Project, a lot of people have been falsely convicted, often, by the way, by eyewitness evidence, which judges and cops and lawyers know is really, really squishy. The average citizen who might sit on a jury tends to think that's infallible. It's not. And many people who've been convicted on eyewitness testimony later exonerated on DNA evidence, which is much less impeachable. As time goes on, more and more of these cases arise. This is why Justice Blackstone said, as a rule of thumb, better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffers. If we have to err, let's err on the side of caution. Let's err on the side of leniency rather than punitiveness, because we just might get it wrong. So trial by jury is a proxy measure for guilt or innocence. It's not a direct measure. Proxy measure is something you use when a direct indicator isn't available. It's a second best settling for thing. So, for example, if I wanted to know the temperature of the sun, well, I could send a space probe up with a thermometer. It would burn out before it got to the sun. Or I can calculate the internal temperature of the sun from its external radiation using a proxy measure. That's typically what scientists do. What's the quality of life? Well, you can't observe quality of life. It's a complex notion. But you can take GTP as a proxy measure. This is what economists often do. Is a GTP going up or down? Is the quality of life going up or down? Now, there's a point of view which says don't settle. William James draws a distinction between the tough-minded approach and the tender-minded approach. And the tough-minded approach will opt for not settling for second best. But to opt for a proxy measure is always to settle. Settling for jury verdicts as proxy measures of knowledge and truth concerning actual guilt and innocence seems attractive if the alternatives are oracle magic and miracle, trial by ordeal, or else complete agnosticism, throwing up our hands and saying, well, we can't be 100% sure that Dinsdale Piranha committed that murder, so therefore we can't say, we'll have to say innocent. We wouldn't do that. But the use of jury verdicts falls short of the sort of strictness required by the JTB standard. That's the point. We never know guilt and innocence in these precise terms. A jury verdict is a guess. It's our best guess because we have to guess. But guesses can be wrong, okay? Actual guilt or innocence may or may not correspond with forensic guilt or innocence. We hope that it does. So when forensic guilt, that is, as determined in court, coincides with actual guilt, when actually guilty people are rightly convicted, that's good. When actually innocent people are forensically innocent, declared innocent by court, that's good. But sometimes there are wrongful convictions, sometimes there are wrongful acquittals. Forensic guilt does not correspond with actual guilt 100%. Legal verdicts are guesswork, therefore legal verdicts are fallible. And this is why Justice Blackstone says, look, plan on a percentage of wrongful convictions. Figure out how to do with it. So legal verdicts are fallible. They're going to fall short of the kind of strict standard that JTB represents. If this is true of law, it's also true of science. We'll bring in Popper again. Scientific assertions are guesswork. Therefore, scientific assertions are fallible. Now, is this to say guesswork is the same as just guesswork? Not necessarily. There are better guesses and worse guesses. What if guesswork is really the best we can do? We cannot say with 100% certainty that Dinsdale Piranha committed that murder. We cannot say with 100% certainty that an asteroid killed off the dinosaurs. But do we just have to remain agnostic and say, well, we'll never know about guilt or innocence. We'll never know about the demise of the dinosaurs. So less than 100% certainty pertains to law, pertains to science, also economics, no exception to that. Using a very strict standard such as JTB, we couldn't claim to act knowingly unless we had perfect knowledge. This could be a problem because when do we ever have perfect knowledge, unbounded perfect knowledge, access to total information? There is a kind of a character, a fictional character known as Homo economicus, which is a model used by a sort of standard economic reasoning, which presumes that when people engage in economic activity, they are 100% rational, they are 100% focused on money as an incentive, and they have unbounded 100% information. But it's now a standard criticism of this that we don't do that. That rarely ever happens. The rational economic model, Homo economicus, typically used to analyze market decisions. Homo economicus uses all information to arrive at an optimal decision, a satisfactory decision. But Herbert Simon won the Nobel Prize in economics on the strength of showing how and why this doesn't happen. And he introduced the notion of what he called bounded rationality as opposed to unbounded rationality. The principle of bounded rationality, as says Simon, is the capacity of the human mind for formulating and solving complex problems. And that's very small compared with the size of the problems whose solution is required for objectively rational behavior in the real world, or even for a reasonable approximation to such objective rationality. Instead of pursuing optimally satisfying decisions, people tend to settle for what he calls satisficing strategies instead. We settle for satisficing when we cannot optimally satisfy. Think about what it takes to buy a car, okay? There's Consumer Reports, best and worst cars of the year. You can go to Carfax and ask Fox. The standard economic model, the rational actor model, assumes that we all do our homework, we have full information on all available cars, then we make the optimal choice, the satisfactory choice in terms of price, availability, payment plans, all the various factors that we should reasonably consider. But who has time to do this? How do people usually buy a car? They ask their friend, hey, you drive this car, you like that car? They check around maybe 2 or 3 cars, and then they buy something out of that mixture. A satisficing outcome, but not a satisfactory outcome according at least to the standard economic actor model. On making a major purchase, she says, I always ask questions and do my research before spending money. Read the Consumer Reports, get the Carfax. Regarding religion, of course, I don't ask questions, I have faith and just believe. This may be too optimistic. If Simon is right, perhaps she doesn't even ask many questions before making a major purchase either. So we have expected utility theory, the old traditional way of doing economics, Homo economicus, and then we have behavioral economics, the sort of thing that Simon does. It's made a great difference in our thinking about economic behavior. What's true of economics? Also true of voting. Here we are, 2020, in an election year again. Like economics, the study of political behavior in democracies uses a rational actor model. Each individual voter seeks maximal information. They read the paper, they check out the platforms, they read those little brochures that the Secretary of State sends you about, this party's position, the majority was for. We all do that, right? We all read the fine print, right? In order to make optimal, satisfactory decisions. But is every individual, in fact, a high information voter? Or are there low information voters? Do voters typically act within frameworks of bounded rationality, making satisficing but suboptimal decisions? Paul Lazarsfeld and colleagues back in the 40s, they studied the 1940-1944 elections, came up with a two-step flow model, which students of voting behavior still use profitably to study voting. Instead of each individual getting their own information, various individuals tend to look to opinion leaders. Those are certain people who are key to influencing others. If you're familiar with the notion of social media influencers, this comes right out of that. And so the mass media, if it's smart, will target those opinion leaders because they're going to diffuse the messages in the mass media to their circle of followers. They don't need to target each and every one of them. At least that's what the two-step flow model, Lazarsfeld and colleagues, suggests. Is every voter a low information voter? Lazarsfeld and company thought so, or at least almost all of them. Individual voters don't act as rational actors in the strict economic sense. They don't gather satisfactorily maximal information, assess it, choose accordingly. Most of them are sheep. They satisfice by looking to the goats, basically. So you could put animals here in the two-step model with really no change in content. A bunch of goats, target the goats. If you want to affect change, the goats will pass it on to the sheep. American politics generally, but certainly American electoral politics, kind of strange. Matt Taibbi, a very interesting book called Griftopia. It's about the subprime mortgage meltdown, the recession in 2008, and the way in which vast numbers of American voters could be persuaded to vote against their economic better interests. If American politics, worth reading, if American politics, says Taibbi, made any sense at all, we wouldn't have two giant political parties of roughly the same size perpetually fighting over the same 5 to 10% swatch of undecided voters, blues versus reds. Instead, the party should be broken up into haves and have-nots. A couple of obnoxious bankers on the Upper East Side running for office against 280 million pissed off credit card customers and credit card and mortgage customers with mortgages underwater. Thomas Frank says more or less the same thing about the American electorate. What's the matter with Kansas, he asks. Kansas had a history of radical populism about a century ago, but that's changed. Strip today's Kansans, says Frank, of their job security, and they head out to become registered Republicans. Push them off the land, and the next thing you know, they're protesting in front of abortion clinics. Squander their life savings on manicures for the CEO, there's a good chance they'll join the John Birch Society. But ask them about the remedies their ancestors proposed, things like unions, antitrust, public ownership, and you might as well be referring to the days when knighthood was in flower. So today we may want to modify the two-step model. There still are mass media influencers, and there still are sheeps and goats. And money has a multiplier effect. So if you're Michael Bloomberg or if you're the Koch brothers, you can have a disproportionate influence, particularly on the opinion leaders. On the other hand, Twitter and Facebook seem to micro-target the individual sheep at the same time. So the model may still have a force, but in a more complex way. Here's the question. Would the rational actor model, Homo economicus, predict all this? Or is voting behavior perhaps an instance, better understood as an instance of bounded rationality? It does seem as if suboptimal can take on a variety of meanings, anywhere from less than maximal to positively counterproductive. And this is the message Thomas Frank hammers home. Why are these people all for the Tea Party? You know, lay off my kid's teacher. No Medicare for my mom. Why do people vote against their own economic best interests? Does bounded rationality point us in the direction of more realistic thinking about how, in a practical way, we use knowledge? Might the bounds of rationality verge into irrational neglect of self-interest as well? And these are all good questions. Now let's think about fuzzy knowledge. Okay, philosophy obviously is my subject, but my other hat is sociology, and I haven't taught that for some time, but I used to quite a lot. And one of the movements that was very popular in sociology when I was a student for some time thereafter, something known as ethnomethodology. And ethnomethodology starts from the insight that human behavior is rule governed. We all know some basic rules about how to do things in society, even if we're not, and often we're not, aware of what those rules are, even if we can't articulate them. At least we don't ordinarily articulate it, but we can. And the way the ethnomethodologists tried to get their research subjects to articulate is they would deliberately provoke and violate what they took to be social rules and norms, and then get people to explain why they were upset when they saw the violation. So one of the typical things, you may have seen this, you may have done this, we would send, as sociology teachers, we would send a student, preferably two, one to do the action, one to observe, into an elevator. Go into an elevator and face the rear. What happens? People get very uncomfortable, very nervous, even upset. Why? Is facing the rear going to make the elevator more dangerous? No. Is it going to make the elevator slower? No. What's the problem? Well, somehow we have this rule in the back of our heads that you don't face the rear of an elevator, you face the front, and you don't look at the person next to you, you don't talk to them, you just kind of stand there and stare, 50-yard stare into the door of the elevator until it opens. And where did we get this idea? Did we have to, for example, like the DMV, did we have to get a booklet and pass a test on riding an elevator before we get an elevator license? No. But probably what happened is we learned this from our parents. Kid gets in an elevator, looks at the next person, dad smacks him and says, don't do that, face front. Okay, so then, you kind of imbibe this as a rule and you internalize it, and it goes, and you don't think about that again for the rest of your life until some freshman gets into the elevator and faces the rear and you say, oh my God, what's going on? And there are a number of experiments one can do. One of the things we used to do, we stopped doing this, with the traditional student population, 18 to 22 years old. Thanksgiving time, we give the assignment, okay, go home for Thanksgiving and treat your parents and your family as if they were strangers for 5 minutes. So instead of putting your key in the door, you ring the doorbell, your mother answers the door, you introduce yourself to her, you ask if you can come in. You ask if you can have a drink of water. You ask where the toilet is, can you use it? And it seems like fairly innocuous stuff. We had to stop doing that because students were getting thrown out of their family homes. Parents were getting so upset at them for just these ordinary, small, seemingly small violations, but violations of rules that people often take to heart. So the point about elevator rules is we all know them. It's a bit of knowledge. We know them in that we can use them. We know them in that we recognize when they're violated, even though we probably can't articulate them in most cases, and we never think to articulate them until or unless some strange, bizarre situation happens where we're forced to do that. So that would be an example of fuzzy knowledge, knowing the rules of doing elevators or of doing family life or anything else in society. It's possible to have knowledge not in your head, but in your fingertips. Believe it or not, I didn't believe this at first. I had to check it out. It's the case. Lennon said this in the interview. Or McCartney says in the interview. Sorry. Lennon and McCartney could not read music. Okay, now, would we want to say the Beatles were not musicians? No. Would we want to say that what they produced is not music? No. Clearly it is. Would we want to say they don't know music? No. But what they don't know is scoring and, some of the formal stuff involved in music. How can you know how to play music? That's a kind of gnosis of fuzzy knowledge without reading music or explaining musical theory, epistemic knowledge, but apparently they could. McCartney said, I don't see music as dots on a page. It's something in my head that goes on. Another ethnomethodologist, David Sudnow, has a book on ways of the hand. He taught himself to play jazz piano just by feeling his way, along the keyboard. You can this goes together, and there's a melody line, and this doesn't go together. And you could kind of, after a while, you learn it by touch, and you can just kind of zone out and play, well, decent improvisational jazz, perhaps. Here's a short video on this if you want to check out the URL. And he actually he quit teaching sociology for a while and started piano teaching. Now, can one know how to play music, gnosis, without reading music or understanding musical theory? Well, when I was a young boy, my parents insisted that I have piano lessons. My brother was forced to do the violin for one day before he quit. I didn't get to quit. And so Frau Weber, my piano teacher, would come over every week, and she would take me through. I had sheet music, and she'd say, okay, this is what you do with your left hand. This is what you do with your right hand. The left hand follows the bass line. Right hand follows the treble line. Put it together, play with feeling, etc. And that's how I learned, such as it was, to play the piano when I was 7, 8, 9 years old. Later on, I learned to play guitar. And to play guitar, you have to form chords. Oh, now it becomes clear. That's what my left hand was doing. It was playing chords. It was doing some rhythmic things, and I was just doing the melody line. Oh, she never told me that. I never got even that much musical theory. So I had a certain sort of rote knowledge of how to play the piano, but I certainly lacked, and I never was very good at it, but I certainly lacked higher level understanding of even some of the basics. And, once you catch on to that, you can use what's called a fake book. Jazz musicians use this all the time. There's a melody line, which you can, if you don't have the melody in your head, and then there are the guitar chords alongside, which you can do with your right hand. If you know what chords are, you can always, and do some variations on that. So musicians can fake it. You go up to a musician and say, do you know such and such a song? Oh, I don't know, but I can fake it. And they can. They kind of, okay, this is the melody line. Kind of figure out what the chords must be. Boom, there we go. So they have musical knowledge. Not everyone can just sit down. I couldn't play in a lounge, even though I can fake a little bit, when nobody else is listening. Not enough to do that. But, and somebody who can do that clearly has considerable musical knowledge, even if they may or may not have full theoretical knowledge, even if they may be like Lennon McCartney. And of course, when Frau Weber tried to teach my pet elephant, she got nowhere at all. Even less far than she got with me. So it may not be crystal clear to say exactly what it takes to have knowledge in your fingertips, but it's pretty clear when somebody does and somebody doesn't, okay? A small child sitting on the piano mashing the keys, or an elephant mashing the keys. This is a being that does not have even that basic gnosis, even that fuzzy knowledge anywhere in their body. Polanyi talks about tacit knowledge. Perhaps not so much an epistemic distinction as a psychological distinction. We know more than we can tell. What we can tell, what we say rests explicitly, what we can say explicitly rests implicitly on what is unspoken, and might become articulated if we choose to do so, or if we are provoked to do so, as in the case, for example, of the elevator rules. There's connoisseurship, okay? You can have knowledge, taste about, paintings or about drinking wine. And if you have this knowledge, it's going to be demonstrable. You fellow connoisseurs are going to know either you have it or you don't. But you might or might not be able to pass a test on this. It might or might not be the sort of thing that somebody could teach you in an academic class, but it's something that you can pick up and acquire. You learn various flavors and smells. You learn what to expect, what kinds of things are appropriate in certain kinds of wines, and that's what this should be. Or, oh no, my God, this is Brett, or this is corked, or you learn that way. And it is a kind of knowledge, although it's a fuzzy kind of knowledge. And then there are objects of ignorance. Okay, you can have knowledge of something without knowing entirely what it is that you have knowledge or acquaintance at least with. If you speak a language, for example, English, and you hear somebody else speaking English, you can't help but eavesdrop. You hear what they're saying. You know, first of all, that it's English, and you know the content that's being spoken. Mais si vous ne parlez pas, par exemple, en français, alors, ce qui est dit ne sera pas transparent. Vous savez peut-être que ce n'est pas tout charbier, et peut-être d'autre part qu'il est en français, mais le contenu ne sera pas clairement connu. What did I just say? Well, if you don't speak French, you may know that it's not just gibberish when you hear it. You might even know that it's French, but the content will not be at all clear. Someone can know French is French without knowing French. There's an object of ignorance. Here's another one, the Rosetta Stone. Some people have heard of the Rosetta Stone because it's also the name of a software program for translation, but of course it's named after the actual Rosetta Stone. When Napoleon went to Egypt, he took along a guy named Champollion who found this stone. And it had 3 languages. It was broken off at the top, but it had hieroglyphs, which nobody could read at that point. It had Demotic Egyptian, and it had Greek, the latter 2 of which people could read. So now they've got a skeleton key. And basically what happened from the Rosetta Stone is that scholars extrapolated and developed the ability to read hieroglyphs. And now we can do that. I have a colleague who was studying at NYU a couple of years ago, and her language was, was reading hieroglyphs on it. I was very impressed. I mean, Hebrew's got nothing on that. None of the languages that I know, nothing on that. Yeah, but we know about that because, again, even though hieroglyphs were simply objects of ignorance, we knew they were language. They represented language, and we just didn't know how to do it, but then we learned. Most of us can't read the Rosetta Stone, any of those 3 languages, but don't we know that these things are languages? I live near Koreatown. Okay, so I see this kind of thing all the time. I do know, in a very important sense, that these signs are in Korean. I just don't know what these very same signs say. So my own language is automatically an object of knowledge. A foreign language, when foreign to me at least, when I don't speak, is an object of ignorance, or maybe. But ignorance is not total, it's partial. I know it's some foreign language or another, I just don't know the content of what that language is saying. Is it wise to use the verb to know in any of these relatively weaker ways, to cover high probability as well as certainty? Certainty is 100% probability. To cover tacit knowledge, to cover Gnostic as well as epistemic frames of mind, knowledge in the fingership, connoisseurship, fuzzy knowledge, objects of ignorance? Well, Descartes would say, no, it's not wise. Knowledge consists only in clear and distinct ideas. Anything weaker than that is just not knowledge, Descartes would say. On the other hand, perhaps so much the worse for René Descartes. Really? You want to say that a musician does not have knowledge in the fingertips when they can't articulate clearly and distinctly what it is they're doing? Socrates, on the other hand, would say yes, it can be wise to do so, and beware of what is known as the heuristic paradox. We're going to read the Meno dialogue down the road. We're going to see how Socrates explicates this. The heuristic paradox is this: if you know what you're looking for, then why look? If you don't know what you're looking for, how can you look? Therefore, inquiry is either unnecessary or impossible. Give it up, QED, go away. In order for it to be possible that, what Socrates does is he tries to take an uneducated boy and draw out from him the fact that he has innate knowledge of geometry. If this can be possible, isn't it the case that he who does not know must have true notions of that which he does not know? That's the question, at least, that Socrates asks. We'll explore that when we come to Meno. So are ideas just born clear? Are ideas only 100% clear, 100% fuzzy? Is it possible to clarify ideas, to take up something that's ill-formed and whip it into better shape, to take up objects of ignorance and make them into better form, objects of knowledge? Also, the problem of induction. Even if I could have fuzzy knowledge of the present, can I have any knowledge of the future? Is it wise to say I know when I'm discussing the future as, for example, I know that it will never snow in LA in July? David Hume would answer clearly this question. He would say no, it is not wise. Whenever we attempt to draw an inductive generalization about any future occurrence based on a number of similar occurrences in the past, we run afoul of what's famously known as Hume's problem of induction. So what's the problem? Well, what is induction? Again, this gets us kind of into the other course, but induction in logic refers to any process of inference which runs from limited premises toward conclusions that outreach the scope of those same premises. So the conclusions are broader than the premises. For example, let's say I notice that certain events have occurred regularly in the past. These are my limited premises. I might go on to generalize that they will always do so as night follows day, or day follows night, so to speak. Deduction draws inferences from the content of what's already known, what's already stated. Induction goes beyond the content of those premises. So if karma is true, then good things always happen to good people, but a non-good thing happened to a good person, so karma is false. Although the content of the conclusion is already in the premises to begin with. If I see the sun rises today and the sun rises tomorrow and the sun rises the next day and the sun rises the day after that and the day after that, I might conclude the sun always rises every morning. Indeed, I might even make that into a covering law. I might make that into a law of nature. The sun will always rise every morning. This is what Hume calls constant conjunction. We call it correlation. It's a necessary condition of causation, but not a necessary and sufficient condition. You need to have more than just correlation. Scurvy, for example, we now know can be prevented by citrus fruits on long voyages. Hence the British Navy sailors are called limeys, and indeed English people now generally are. It took a while to sort that out. People would start developing scurvy about the time that the beer ration ran out once they got away from port. And good empiricists said, well, it's because they're not getting enough beer. We should send more beer. But then they kept getting scurvy, and finally someone, figured out that it had to do with ascorbic acid and that sort of thing that citrus fruits contain. That solved that problem. But simply the correlation of scurvy and running out of beer wasn't enough to establish cause and effect. I might even go so far as to call my generalization a law of nature, a generalization like this that I have inductively derived, a general rule which covers any instance of the sort of event in question, whether it's past, present, or future. Indeed, if I do generalize to future events, I am forced to assume a principle called the uniformity of nature. That is, I expect future events to follow the same pattern inductively derived by generalizing about past events. So what if I say, well, I know the sun will rise tomorrow, or I know tomorrow when I put kettle on fire, kettle will boil. Well, okay. Every day in my experience, without fail, every morning the sun has risen. Every day I like to make tea. In the morning I put kettle on fire. Kettle always boils. And many yesterdays before yesterday it did that. Problem is, if we suppose that knowledge is empirical, and we're jumping a little bit ahead to one of our next problems, and Hume certainly is going to assume that, the future is the one bit of time about which we have no experience. Assuming that there is such a thing as time, and we have experience of the past because it's happened, we are having experience of the future because it is happening, of the present, sorry, because it is happening. Of the future, we have no experience whatsoever because it hasn't yet happened. So how do I know that tomorrow, instead of kettle boiling, I put kettle on fire and kettle would freeze? It might. Suppose I get up in the morning and the sun doesn't rise. Maybe it won't. Maybe kettle will freeze, maybe sun will not rise. We can't extrapolate from past experience in a non-circular way and say this is the case. But, someone may respond, this is a law of nature. This is a covering law. And covering laws cover all possible instances, past, present, and future. Well, Hume is not impressed. What are the putative laws of nature except generalizations based on past instances? And thus simply to invoke the past instances to explain the future just begs the question. Well, the future is explained by the past because in the past has explained the future. Yes, but we don't know what's going to happen, and still don't know what's going to happen in the future. Sure, we can move from cause to effect. This simply is not a matter of knowledge. It's not a matter of logic. It is a leap of faith. This is Hume's big challenge. But someone may respond, how can we carry on without expecting uniformity between past and future? I got to set my alarm clock. What if I don't set my alarm clock and I'm late to work and I get fired? Okay, Hume's response to that is, well, okay, what you've just given me is a psychological fact about yourself, that you're anxious and nervous. You haven't told me anything of any epistemological or philosophical importance. You haven't told me anything about induction or anything about our ability to claim knowledge of a period of time about which we have no experience. So, constant conjunction does not imply causal connection, even though we're in the habit of thinking that it does. But expectation is not the same thing as knowledge. Psychological states are not the same as epistemological states. We don't have the right to say we know X because we expect X. And apparently Hume's girlfriend was a skeptic too. Well, Bertie Russell expounds Hume's problem of induction by means of this example. Chicken comes out every day and sees the farmer's wife. Farmer's wife scatters the chicken feed. Chicken eats. Chicken's happy. Good. Every single day this has happened. Each new day the chicken expects to be fed, and this expectation has been rewarded until one day the farmer's wife comes out. She grabs the chicken by the neck and wrings it. Showing, as Russell concludes, that, quote, more refined views as to the uniformity of nature would have been useful to the chicken. Here are 1,001 days in the life of a Thanksgiving turkey. Constant conjunction. The trend of expectations is uniform. Every day he gets to eat, he gets bigger, etc., until that one day when all expectations are off. By the way, what happens to baby turkeys the day after Thanksgiving? They go to foster farms. Now, I may expect sun to rise and kettle to boil. Chicken may expect to be fed as usual. But these are psychological facts, these expectations, and these are never going to settle epistemological or other philosophical questions. This is of a piece with Hume's other claim previously that causation is a psychological expectation, not necessarily a feature of external reality. And we'll come back to that subsequently. I just know there's life after death, right? How many people have said things like that? Well, if, as Hume thought, knowledge is based on experience, no. Even Socrates, who did not agree with Hume that that knowledge is based on life experience, would claim that no one, Socrates himself included, really knew what death is. Is there life after death? Well, it is, as Shakespeare says, that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. Dead men tell no tales. Well, but we have near-death experiences. You ever notice something about people who tell you about near-death experiences? They tend to be alive while they're telling the tale. Is that a problem? Might there be another explanation for seeing that light at the end of the tunnel? So one of the salutary effects of studying philosophy is that one becomes skeptical whenever anybody starts with the claim, I just know. Well, I don't know it for a fact, but I just know it's true. And if you've paid attention to philosophy, you are entitled in many cases to call liar, liar, pants on fire when you hear a claim like this. Thus, to sum up where we've gone so far, we talked about P1 and P2. P1 is the Western tradition of rational inquiry as such, philosophy in sense one. And that's a very important. We're going to come back to one way in which this is important down the road. But the main operative meaning of philosophy thought, most of human history and certainly into the present, is P2. That is, that academic discipline, and it's just one among many, and we treated that in the first lecture, one among many, which treats of problems in one or more three areas: metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. So I hope at this point now we've walked through some of the issues in each of these areas, and I hope you have a better understanding, even a good understanding perhaps, of what's there. Now, what we'll do next in the next three lectures is to turn to three major problems. The problem of rationalism and determinism, the problem of analytic and synthetic propositions, and finally, the problem of what is the goal of our knowledge. And then, having considered those three problems, I think you'll have enough ammunition under your belt that we can go on and do some reading. So we'll start reading some of the primary texts in the tradition of philosophy. Some, first of all, from the pre-Socratics. Then we'll move on to a couple from Socrates. I mentioned the Eudipher dialogue, the Meno dialogue. We'll read the Apology, and then we'll read just a little bit of the Phaedo dialogue. From there, we'll leap ahead to the early modern period and read some of the meditations by René Descartes, the first three meditations out of the total of 6. And then we will finish our readings this semester with an interesting passage by a German philosopher named Hegel, from a work called The Phenomenology of Mind or Phenomenology of Spirit. The passage in question is the dialectic of lordship and bondage, or the dialectic of mastery and slavery. And then the last lecture, and then we'll stop the readings by then, I want to give is to talk about what happens after Hegel as his notions get developed by three interesting thinkers: Ludwig Feuerbach, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Nietzsche. So that's where we are for now. So good day, and I will see you for the next lecture, Rationalism versus Empiricism.